we read the scripture this morning, I want to give a special hello to all the people who are watching on Facebook Live. You are a congregation that we appreciate. You watch when you can. You may be watching now. But we feel your presence, and we appreciate the ways in which God is working through this church to reach a wider audience.
Okay.
Bless you for being with us.
Yeah.
Our scripture today comes from page 81, Luke's Gospel, Luke 18, 9 to 14. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves or rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector here. For I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, Jesus says, this man went down to his home justified, rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. May the Lord speak to us in the reading and hearing of God's word. This summer, our sermons are all about the stories of Jesus, the parables. We're hoping to examine some of these familiar stories in the Bible and give them a new take. Look at them with modern eyes and ask contemporary questions of them. So throughout the series, we've endeavored to take stories that most of us have heard before or grew up hearing and ask our questions now. Today we examine the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector, Luke's parable about two men who went up to the temple in Jerusalem to pray. Now perhaps you heard this story in Sunday school, once upon a time, or listened to a sermon that explained it to you. If you did, this is what you probably heard. So two men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, an overzealous, inflexible religious hypocrite. He worked hard at being pious, but he was so incredibly proud of his accomplishments where faith was concerned that you couldn't reach him. His pride overwhelmed all his good deeds, and for all his virtue, God didn't like him at all. By contrast, we see here a tax collector also at the temple not far away, praying to himself and to God quietly, not showing off at all. And though he led a completely selfish life, engaging in business practices that hurt his people, on the whole he was a decent kind of guy, and everyone had sympathy for him. Or maybe you learned that this parable was a criticism of the Jews. This Pharisee was a typical Jewish leader, a prime example of the kind of people Jesus didn't like, so rigorous in following the letter of the law that his heart was empty and he lacked humility. In contrast comes along a sinner who has no respect for his people, even cheats them on a regular basis with high taxes, but in his heart he loved God, proved himself to be more spiritual even than the religious leaders. Both interpretations miss Jesus' point. Both shortchange the faith of the Jews, they misrepresent the Pharisees, and misunderstand the tax collector. It might be shocking to learn that both a Pharisee who was disdainful of others and a tax collector who was penitent would have blown the minds of Jesus' audience. They just couldn't take those caricatures in. Neither would have been believable. So the story would have challenged everything they knew, thought they knew. The story of Jesus would have made them scratch their heads and wonder what in the world he was trying to say. So what is he saying? Let's take a closer look. In the first place, this parable says we need to listen to each other. See, Pharisees weren't dismissive. They were some of the most faithful rabbis in all of Palestine. They were like town rabbis, the village rabbi, the person who would listen or go to your house when you had a problem, the person you sought out for wisdom, the person whose advice you trusted, the person who could interpret Scripture for you. They encouraged faith in people. It would have been shocking to think a Pharisee would criticize anybody, never mind have such disdain for someone who's trying to pray. And by the same token, no one would have expected the tax collector to be humble. Tax collectors applied for their position from the Roman government. It was a lucrative assignment. Most of them lined their pockets by overcharging on taxes. They were corrupt. These kind of jobs appealed to corrupt people. They preyed on the misfortunes of the Jews. They took advantage of others. It's hard to imagine one of them coming to the temple with a pang of conscience. So the parable shakes up the stereotypes of Jesus' disciples. When he points to the vanity of the Pharisee, he reminds us that even people with great religious power and integrity are human. And the very respect that they are afforded and the power they have makes them vulnerable to abusing that power. One of the issues that may well define the Church of Jesus Christ in our lifetimes, more than we know probably, is the clergy abuse scandal. For 2 decades now, revelations of clergy misconduct have been revealed in our newspapers in a cascade of more and more evidence of the grossest kind of clergy abuse of power. Discovered first by the Boston Globe Spotlight team in many neighborhoods of Boston, waves of new allegations have filled the last 2 decades and come from almost every city in our country, every country in the world, and every continent. And though it seems to be especially bad in the Roman Catholic Church, no denomination is unscathed. And no one is immune, apparently, from the temptation to abuse clergy power. At their convention this spring, it was really disappointing to hear that the Southern Baptists seemed to be mired in reports of new scandals. If there's a trend or a pattern in this crisis, it is that the churches that have the most unquestioned authority in their clergy have created a culture where it's really hard to hold those clergy accountable. And it's hard for parishioners to make their voices heard when things go wrong. And it makes the culture condone or approve of sometimes the worst behavior. As a result, trust in clergy and in the church suffer enormously. How could they not? And part of our disillusionment as a society comes from the fact that we've put our clergy on a pedestal in some cases and rarely questioned them. And I think the same thing has happened for some police officers. This week, 4 police officers were fired from the Chicago police force after being found guilty of covering up the circumstances in the death of Laquan McDonald. A death for which Officer Jason Van Dyke has been held accountable and convicted of second-degree murder. Here, these officers that wrote stories about what they observed have now been held accountable to the same standards of racial justice that most of us believe we all need to feel safe in this country. See, the pattern of American police officers shooting unarmed African Americans has become disturbing enough that people are beginning to question some of the ways in which police are trained and some of their sensitivities in a crisis. See, in our hearts we know that none of us are ultimately safe if cops are allowed to shoot unarmed citizens with impunity, whatever their race. And Jesus tells stories like this one to challenge us to hold our leaders and public servants accountable. By the same token, if a tax collector could show remorse, perhaps all those we label sinners struggle in ways we never imagined. And this parable teaches us, challenges us to really think about the people we dismiss out of hand. Who are the tax collectors today? And what is the cost of our hatred? For them or for us? Christ's parable asks us to think about that and to help us give people a second look, especially the people that we write off. He challenges us to wonder ourselves, who are these people of color that we don't usually talk to? Who are these people who come from a different class that we think we have nothing in common with? He challenges us to stop judging those who struggle in ways we can't always imagine. For the people on the streets who struggle with mental illness, how can we avoid dismissing them so easily? So Jesus says we need to see each other more clearly. The ones we revere and the ones we despise. And secondly, he says we need to talk to each other. It says in the parable that the Pharisee was standing by himself when he prayed. And the tax collector was standing at a distance. He'd come to the temple to pray, and part of prayer in the Jewish tradition is that you just talk to God, but we know that part of prayer and part of the healing part of prayer involves talking to one another and relating to people. How different things might have been if these two could just talk to each other. How different if the Pharisee could look this man in the eye and think about his own disdain. How different if the tax collector could apologize for his greed and see the harm he'd done to others. How different would it be if he could face the suffering he'd caused and somehow wrestle with what it might mean to make restitution. I want to hold up a show that a lot of people like and that has continued to baffle everyone with its popularity over 22 years. The View. It's a popular television show on ABC, started by Barbara Walters in 1997. In its 22nd year, morning television, Every day, women from different parties, different perspectives, different backgrounds come together at a table and talk about the hot topics of the day in politics and culture. The current panels, moderated by stand-up comedian, progressive black leader Whoopi Goldberg. Others at the table on the show include Republican television personality Meghan McCain, attorney Sunny Hostin, comedian Joy Behar. Winner of 30 Daytime Emmys, The View has a certain kind of longevity and popularity that seems, I think, to stem from its ability to model talking about hard issues with people who may not agree with you. Something most of us avoid like the plague. If you're hosting relatives this week, what's the first thing you think about? All the things you better not talk about. Okay? You can just imagine all the things you just can't even bring up or mention. Oddly, we've lost the ability to listen to people who don't share our view. And that might be something this parable could encourage us to do. Finally, I think the parable says, beware of the temptation to feel satisfied with yourself. That's what the audience, that's the setup for the parable. That's what Jesus was worried about in his audience. He told this parable for people who felt so self-righteous. And so it's a story about two men. It's a story about his audience, but it's a story for us. See, the key to the story is that it helps us think about what self-righteousness really looks like in someone else so that we can begin to see it in ourselves. It says, he told the story for those who were quick to despise others. Few parables could be more appropriate to a time in our nation when we need a new vision of how to get along. Jesus says it's wrong to become so entrenched, so satisfied with yourself that you lose the ability to even see or reflect on your own prejudice. It's short-sighted to assume you're right all the time. It's a mistake to dismiss those who don't agree with you. I saw a funny sign on Facebook yesterday. It was a church sign from Virginia, and it's, and you know those signs where the people are supposed to put out their sermon topic or a thought for the day? It said, America, love it or leave it. And then I looked at the name of the church, Friendship Baptist. We've always been a nation of first. We've been a place with a bold vision of equality and justice from colonial times. We haven't always lived up to our ideals. Sometimes we've fallen far short. But in our best moments, we remember how much we need each other. In our best moments, we thank God for all the people here, and all the people who are being drawn here, and all the people who catch the dream or see the vision and work hard to be part of it, because that's what's enriched our land with new industry and creativity. Now I believe we are in the midst of a whole new effort, an effort to create something that's new on the face of the earth, a multicultural society that embraces people from many ethnicities and every religion known to man and woman. Families are changing. We have now many interracial couples, many LGBT families, many multicultural communities, huge religious diversity. And as a society, we're actually in the throes of a debate about how to prepare for a time when Caucasian Europeans will be in the minority. I hope that some of our early fumbles and outright folly are just the birth pains, the labor pains of a society giving birth to a new multicultural norm. While it's tempting to assume that we can stop this trend or revert somehow to an imagined homogeneous white America, there is no turning back. No matter how cruel our border policies, it hasn't really kept people from seeking asylum in the tens of thousands. No matter how vicious our prejudice or how high the spike in hate crimes, we cannot turn back the clock. But who would really want to? No matter how loud or appalling the voices that say folks should be sent home, this is home. They're not going anywhere. We are home. And we need to make this a home for everyone. It's a myth to imagine that we can somehow turn back the clock or pull up the gangplank on this ship. God has set before us the same opportunity that Jesus was talking about 2,000 years ago. You have a chance to create heaven on earth in the way you treat one another. You have an opportunity to bring God's kingdom here, now, or not.